The estuaries of rivers appeal strongly to an adventurous imagination. This appeal is not always a charm, for there are estuaries of a particularly dispiriting ugliness, lowlands, mud flats, or perhaps barren sandhills, without beauty of form or amenity of aspect, covered with a shabby and scanty vegetation, conveying the impression of poverty and uselessness. Sometimes such an ugliness is merely a repulsive mask. A river whose estuary resembles a breach in a sand rampart may flow through a most fertile country, but all the estuaries of great rivers have their fascination, the attractiveness of an open portal. Water is friendly to man, the ocean a part of nature, farthest removed in the unchangeableness and majesty of its might from the spirit of mankind, has ever been a friend to the enterprising nations of the earth. And of all the elements, this is the one to which men have always been prone to trust themselves, as if its immensity held a reward as vast as itself. From the offing the open estuary promises every possible fruition to adventurous hopes. That road open to enterprise and courage invites the explorer of coasts to new efforts towards the fulfillment of great expectations. The commander of the first Roman galley must have looked with an intense absorption upon the estuary of the Thames as he turned the beaked prow of his ship to the westward under the brow of the North Foreland. The estuary of the Thames is not beautiful, it has no noble features, no romantic grandeur of aspect, no smiling geniality, but it is wide open, spacious, inviting, hospitable at the first glance, with a strange air of mysteriousness which lingers about it to this very day. The navigation of his craft must have engrossed all the Roman's attention in the calm of a summer's day. He would choose his weather when the single row of long sweeps, the galley would be a light one, not a trireme, could fall in easy cadence upon a sheet of water like plate glass, reflecting faithfully the classic form of his vessel and the contour of the lonely shores close on his left hand. I assume he followed the land and passed through what is at present known as Margate Roads, groping his careful way along the hidden sandbanks whose every tail and spit has its beacon or buoy nowadays. He must have been anxious, though no doubt he had collected beforehand on the shores of the Gauls a store of information from the talk of traders, adventurers, fishermen, slave dealers, pirates, all sorts of unofficial men connected with the sea in a more or less reputable way. He would have heard of channels and sandbanks, of natural features of the land useful for sea marks, of villages and tribes, and modes of barter, and precautions to take, with the instructive tales about native chiefs dyed more or less blue, whose character for greediness, ferocity, or amiability must have been expounded to him with that capacity for vivid language, which seems joined naturally to the shadiness of moral character and recklessness of disposition, with that sort of spiced food provided for his anxious thought, watchful for strange men, strange beasts, strange turns of the tide. He would make the best of his way up, a military seaman with a short sword on thigh and a bronze helmet on his head, the pioneer post-captain of an imperial fleet, was the tribe inhabiting the Isle of Thanet, of a ferocious disposition, I wonder, and ready to fall, with stone-studded clubs and wooden lances hardened in the fire, upon the backs of unwary mariners. Amongst the great commercial streams of these islands, the Thames is the only one I think open to romantic feeling, from the fact that the sight of human labor and the sounds of human industry do not come down its shores to the very sea, destroying the suggestion of mysterious vastness caused by the configuration of the shore. The broad inlet of the shallow North Sea passes gradually into the contracted shape of the river, but for a long time the feeling of the open water remains with the ship steering to the westward through one of the lighted and buoyed passageways of the Thames, such as Queen's Channel, Prince's Channel, 4-Fathom Channel, or else coming down the Swin from the north. The rush of the yellow flood tide hurries her up as if into the unknown between the two fading lines of the coast. There are no features to this land, no conspicuous, far-famed landmarks for the eye. There is nothing so far down to tell you of the greatest agglomeration of mankind on earth, dwelling no more than 25 miles away, where the sun sets in a blaze of color, flaming on a gold background, and the dark, low shores trend towards each other, and in the great silence the deep, faint booming of the big guns being tested at Shoeburyness hangs about the Nore, a historical spot in the keeping of one of England's appointed guardians. The Nore sand remains covered at low water and never seen by human eye, but the Nore is a name to conjure with visions of historical events, of battles, of fleets, of mutinies, of watch and ward kept upon the great throbbing heart of the state. This ideal point of the estuary, this center of memories, is marked upon the steely gray expanse of the waters by a light ship, painted red, that from a couple of miles off looks like a cheap and bizarre little toy. I remember how, on coming up the river for the first time, I was surprised at the smallness of that vivid object, a tiny warm speck of crimson, lost in an immensity of gray tones. I was startled as if of necessity. The principal beacon in the waterway of the greatest town on earth should have presented imposing proportions, and behold, the brown sprit sail of a barge hid it entirely from my view. Coming in from the eastward, the bright coloring of the light ship, marking the part of the river committed to the charge of an admiral, the commander-in-chief at the Nore, accentuates the dreariness of the great breadth of the Thames estuary, but soon the course of the ship opens the entrance of the Medway, with its men-of-war moored in line, and the long wooden jetty of Port Victoria, with its few low buildings like the beginning of a hasty settlement upon a wild and unexplored shore. The famous Thames barges sit in brown clusters upon the water with an effect of birds floating upon a pond. On the imposing expanse of the great estuary, the traffic of the port where so much of the world's work and the world's thinking is being done becomes insignificant, scattered, streaming away in thin lines of ships, stringing themselves out into the eastern quarter, through the various navigable channels of which the Nore lightship marks the divergence. The coasting traffic inclines to the north, the deep water ships steer east, with a southern inclination on through the downs, to the most remote ends of the world. In the widening of the shores, sinking low in the gray, smoky distances, the greatness of the sea receives the mercantile fleet of good ships that London sends out upon the turn of every tide. They follow each other, going very close by the Essex shore, such as the beads of a rosary told by businesslike ship owners for the greater profit of the world, They slip one by one into the open, while in the offing the inward-bound ships come up singly and in bunches from under the sea horizon, closing the mouth of the river between Orfordness and North Foreland. They all converge upon the Nore, the warm speck of red upon the tones of drab and grey, with the distant shores running together towards the west, low and flat like the sides of an enormous canal. The sea reach of the Thames is straight, and once Sheerness is left behind, its banks seem very uninhabited, except for the cluster of houses which in Southend, or here and there, a lonely wooden jetty where petroleum ships discharge their dangerous cargoes, and the oil storage tanks, low and round with slightly domed roofs, peep over the edge of the foreshore, as it were a village of Central African huts, imitated in iron, bordered by the black and shining mudflats. The level marsh extends for miles. Away in the far background the land rises, closing the view with a continuous wooded slope, forming in the distance an interminable rampart overgrown with bushes. Then, on the slight turn of the lower Hope Reach, clusters of factory chimneys come distinctly into view, tall and slender above the squat ranges of cement works in Gray's and Green Heath, smoking quietly at the top against the great blaze of a magnificent sunset. They give an industrial character to the scene, speak of work, manufacturers, and trade as palm groves on the coral strands of distant islands speak of the luxuriant grace, beauty, and vigor of tropical nature. The houses of Gravesend crowd upon the shore with an effect of confusion, as if they had tumbled down haphazard from the top of the hill at the back. The flatness of the Kentish shore ends there. A fleet of steam tugs lies at anchor in front of the various piers, a conspicuous church spire, the first seen distinctly coming from the sea, has a thoughtful grace, the serenity of a fine form above the chaotic disorder of men's houses. But on the other side of the flat Essex side, a shapeless and desolate red edifice, a vast pile of bricks with many windows and a slate roof, more inaccessible than an alpine slope, towers over the bend in monstrous ugliness, the tallest, heaviest building for miles around, a thing like a hotel, like a mansion of flats, all to let, exiled into these fields out of a street in West Kensington, just round the corner, as it were, on a pier defined with stone blocks and wooden piles, a white mast, slender like a stalk of straw, and crossed by a yard like a knitting needle, flying the signals of flag and balloon, watches over a set of heavy dock gates. Mast heads and funnel tops of ships peep above the ranges of corrugated iron roofs. This is the entrance to Tilbury Dock, the most recent of all London docks, the nearest to the sea. Between the crowded houses of Gravesend and the monstrous red brick pile on the Essex shore, the ship is surrendered fairly to the grasp of the river. That hint of loneliness, that soul of the sea, which had accompanied her as far as the lower Hope Reach, abandons her at the turn of the first bend above. The salt, acrid flavor is gone out of the air, together with a sense of unlimited space opening free beyond the threshold of sandbanks below the Nore. The waters of the sea rush on past Gravesend, tumbling the big mooring buoys laid along the face of the town. But the sea freedom stops short there. surrendering the salt tide to the needs, the artifices, the contrivances of toiling men. Wharves, landing places, dock gates, waterside stairs follow each other continuously, right up to London Bridge, and the hum of men's work fills the river with a menacing, muttering note as of a breathless, ever-driving gale. The waterway, so fair above and wide below, flows oppressed by bricks and mortar and stone, by blackened timber and grimed glass and rusty iron covered with black barges, whipped up by paddles and screws, overburdened with craft, overhung with chains, overshadowed by walls, making a steep gorge for its bed, filled with a haze of smoke and dust. This stretch of the Thames from London Bridge to the Albert Docks is to other watersides of river ports what a virgin forest would be to a garden. It is a thing grown up, not made. It recalls a jungle by the confused, varied, and impenetrable aspect of the buildings that line the shore, not according to a planned purpose, but as if sprung up by accident from scattered seeds, like the matted growth of bushes and creepers veiling the silent depths of an unexplored wilderness. They hide the depths of London's infinitely varied, vigorous, seething life. In other river ports it is not so. They lie open to their stream, with quays like broad clearings, with streets like avenues cut through thick timber for the convenience of trade. I am thinking now of river ports. I have seen of Antwerp, for instance, of Nantes or Bordeaux, or even Old Rouen, where the night watchman of ships elbows on rail gaze at shop windows and brilliant cafes, and see the audience go in and come out of the opera house. But London, the oldest and greatest of river ports, does not possess as much as 100 yards of open quays upon its river front. Dark and impenetrable at night, like the face of a forest, is the London waterside. It is the waterside of watersides, where only one aspect of the world's life can be seen, and only one kind of men toils on the edge of the stream. The lightless walls seem to spring from the very mud upon which the stranded barges lie, and the narrow lanes coming down to the foreshore resemble the paths of smashed bushes and crumbled earth where big game comes to drink on the banks of tropical streams. Behind the growth of the London waterside, the docks of London spread out unsuspected, smooth and placid, lost amongst the buildings like dark lagoons hidden in a thick forest. They lie concealed in the intricate growth of houses, with a few stalks of mastheads here and there overtopping the roof of some four-story warehouse. It is a strange conjunction, this of roofs and mastheads, of walls and yard arms. I remember once having the incongruity of the relation brought home to me in a practical way. I was the chief officer of a fine ship, just docked with a cargo of wool from Sydney after a 90 days' passage. In fact, we had not been in more than half an hour, and I was still busy making her fast to the stone post of a very narrow quay in front of a lofty warehouse. An old man with a gray whisker under the chin and brass buttons on his pilot cloth jacket hurried up along the quay, hailing my ship by name. He was one of those officials called berthing masters, not the one who had berthed us, but another who apparently had been busy securing a steamer at the other end of the dock. I could see from afar his hard blue eyes staring at us, as if fascinated with a queer sort of absorption. I wondered what that worthy sea dog had found to criticize in my ship's rigging. and I too glanced aloft anxiously. I could see nothing wrong there, but perhaps that superannuated fellow craftsman was simply admiring the ship's perfect order aloft. I thought with some secret pride for the chief officers responsible for his ship's appearance, and as to her outward condition, he is the man to praise or blame. Meantime, the old salt, ex-coasting skipper, was writ large all over his person, had hobbled up alongside in his bumpy, shiny boots, and waving an arm, short and thick, like the flipper of a seal, terminated by a paw red as an uncooked beefsteak, addressed the poop in a muffled, faint, roaring voice, as if a sample of every North Sea fog of his life had been permanently lodged in his throat. "Haul 'em round, Mr. Mate," were his words. "If you don't look sharp, you'll have your topgallant yards through the windows of that 'ere warehouse presently." This was the only cause of his interest in the ship's beautiful spars. I own that, for a time, I was struck dumb by the bizarre associations of yard arms and window panes. To break windows is the last thing one would think of in connection with a ship's topgallant yard, unless indeed one were an experienced berthing master in one of the London docks. This old chap was doing his little share of the world's work with proper efficiency. His little blue eyes had made out the danger many hundred yards off. His rheumatic feet, tired with balancing that squat body for many years upon the decks of small coasters, and more sore by miles of tramping upon the flagstones of the dockside, had hurried up in time to avert a ridiculous catastrophe. I answered him pettishly, I fear, and as if I had known all about it before. All right, can't do everything at once." He remained nearby, muttering to himself till the yards had been hauled round at my order, and then raised again his foggy, thick voice. "None too soon," he observed, with a critical glance up at the towering side of the warehouse. "That's a half-sovereign in your pocket, Mr. Mate. You should always look first how you are for them windows before you begin to breast in your ship to the quay." The view of ships lying moored in some of the older docks of London has always suggested to my mind the image of a flock of swans, kept in the flooded backyard of grim tenement houses. The flatness of the walls surrounding the dark pool on which they float brings out wonderfully the flowing grace of the lines on which a ship's hull is built. The lightness of these forms, devised to meet the winds and the seas, makes by contrast with the great piles of bricks, the chains and cables of their moorings appear very necessary, as if nothing less could prevent them from soaring upwards and over the roofs. The least puff of wind stealing round the corners of the dock buildings stirs these captives fettered to rigid shores. It is as if the soul of a ship were impatient of confinement. Those masted hulls, relieved of their cargo, become restless at the slightest hint of the wind's freedom. However tightly moored, they range a little at their bursts, swaying imperceptibly the spire-like assemblages of cordage and spars. You can detect their impatience by watching the sway of the mastheads against the motionless, the soulless gravity of mortar and stones. As you pass alongside each hopeless prisoner chained to the quay, the slight grinding noise of the wooden fenders makes a sound of angry muttering. But after all, it may be good for ships to go through a period of restraint and repose, as the restraint and self-communion of inactivity may be good for an unruly soul. Not indeed that I mean to say that ships are unruly. On the contrary, they are faithful creatures, as so many men can testify, and faithfulness is a great restraint, the strongest bond laid upon the self-will of men and ships on this globe of land and sea. This interval of bondage in the docks rounds each period of a ship's life, with the sense of accomplished duty, of an effectively played part in the work of the world. The dock is the scene of what the world would think the most serious part in the light, bounding, swaying life of a ship. But there are docks and docks. The ugliness of some docks is appalling. Wild horses would not drag from me the name of a certain river in the north whose narrow estuary is inhospitable and dangerous, and whose docks are like a nightmare of dreariness and misery. Their dismal shores are studded thickly with scaffold-like enormous timber structures, whose lofty heads are veiled periodically by the infernal gritty night of a cloud of coal dust. The most important ingredient for getting the world's work along is distributed there under the circumstances of the greatest cruelty meted out to helpless ships. Shut up in the desolate circuit of these basins, you would think a free ship would droop and die like a wild bird put into a dirty cage. But a ship, perhaps because of her faithfulness to men, will endure an extraordinary lot of ill usage. Still, I have seen ships issue from certain docks like half-dead prisoners from a dungeon, to be dragged, overcome, wholly disguised in dirt, and with their men rolling white eyeballs and black and worried faces raised to a heaven which, in its smoky and soiled aspect, seemed to reflect the sordidness of the earth below. One thing, however, may be said for the docks of the port of London, on both sides of the river, for all the complaints of their insufficient equipment, of their obsolete rules of failure, they say, in the matter of quick dispatch, no ship need ever issue from their gates in a half-fainting condition. London is a general cargo port, as it only proper for the greatest capital of the world to be. General cargo ports belong to the aristocracy of the earth's trading places, and in that aristocracy London, as it is its way, has a unique physiognomy. The absence of picturesqueness cannot be laid to the charge of the docks opening into the Thames. For all my unkind comparisons to swans and backyards, it cannot be denied that each dock or group of docks along the north side of the river has its own individual attractiveness, beginning with the cozy little St. Catherine's dock, lying overshadowed and black like a quiet pool amongst rocky crags, through the venerable and sympathetic London docks, with not a single line of rails in the whole of their area, and the aroma of spices lingering between its warehouses, with their far-famed wine cellars, down through the interesting group of West India docks, the fine docks at Blackwall, on past the galleons reach entrance of the Victoria and Albert docks, right down to the vast gloom of the great basins in Tilbury. Each of these places of restraint for ships has its own peculiar physiognomy, its own expression, and what makes them unique and attractive is their common trait of being romantic in their usefulness. In their way, they are as romantic as the river they serve is unlike all the other commercial streams of the world. The coziness of the St. Catherine's dock, the old world air of the London docks remain impressed upon the memory. The docks down the river, abreast of Woolwich, are imposing by their proportions and the vast scale of the ugliness that forms their surroundings, ugliness so picturesque as to become a delight to the eyes. When one talks of the Thames docks, beauty is a vain word, but romance has lived too long upon the river not to have thrown a mantle of glamour upon its banks. The antiquity of the port appeals to the imagination by the long chain of adventurous enterprises that had their inception in the town and floated out into the world on the waters of the river. Even the newest of the docks, the Tilbury Dock, shares in the glamour conferred by historical associations. Queen Elizabeth has made one of her progresses down there, not one of her journeys of pomp and ceremony, but an anxious business progress at a crisis of national history. The menace of that time has passed away, and now Tilbury is known by its docks. These are very modern, but their remoteness and isolation upon the Essex Marsh, the days of failure attending their creation, invested there with a romantic air. Nothing in those days could have been more striking than the vast empty basins surrounded by miles of bare quays and the ranges of cargo sheds where 2 or 3 ships seemed lost like bewitched children in a forest of gaunt hydraulic cranes. One received a wonderful impression of utter abandonment, of wasted efficiency. From the first, the Tilbury docks were very efficient and ready for their task, but they had come perhaps too soon into the field. A great future lies before Tilbury docks. They will never fill a long-felt want, in the sacramental phrase that is applied to railways, tunnels, newspapers, and new editions of books. They were too early in the field. The want will never be felt because, free of the trammels of the tide, easy of access, magnificent and desolate, they are already there, prepared to take and keep the biggest ships that float upon the sea. They are worthy of the oldest river port in the world, and truth to say, for all the criticisms flung upon the heads of the dock companies, the other docks of the Thames are no disgrace to the town with a population greater than that of some commonwealths. The growth of London as a well-equipped port has been slow, while not unworthy of a great centre of distribution. It must not be forgotten that London has not the backing of great industrial districts or great fields of natural exploitation. In this it differs from Liverpool, from Cardiff, from Newcastle, from Glasgow, and therein the Thames differs from the Mersey, from the Tyne, from the Clyde. It is an historical river. It is a romantic stream flowing through the center of great affairs, and for all the criticism of the river's administration, my contention is that its development has been worthy of its dignity. For a long time the stream itself could accommodate quite easily the oversea and coasting traffic. That was in the days when, in the part called the Pool, just below London Bridge, the vessels moored stem and stern, in the very strength of the tide, formed one solid mass like an island covered with a forest of gaunt leafless trees, and when the trade had grown too big for the river, there came the St. Catherine's docks and the London docks, magnificent undertakings answering to the need of their time. The same may be said of the other artificial lakes, full of ships that go in and out upon this high road to all parts of the world. The labor of the imperial waterway goes on from generation to generation, goes on day and night. Nothing ever arrests its sleepless industry but the coming of a heavy fog, which clothes the teeming stream in a mantle of impenetrable stillness. After the gradual cessation of all sound and movement on the faithful river, only the ringing of ships' bells is heard, mysterious and muffled in the white vapor from London Bridge right down to the Nore, for miles and miles, in a decrescendo tinkling, to where the estuary broadens out into the North Sea, and the anchored ships lie scattered thinly in the shrouded channels between the sandbanks of the Thames mouth, through the long and glorious tale of years of the river's strenuous service to its people. These are its only breathing times. A ship in dock surrounded by quays and the walls of warehouses has the appearance of a prisoner meditating upon freedom in the sadness of a free spirit put under restraint. Chain cables and stout ropes keep her bound to stone posts at the edge of a paved shore, and a berthing master with brass buttons on his coat walks about like a weather-beaten and ruddy gaoler, casting jealous, watchful glances upon the moorings that fetter a ship lying passive and still and safe, as if lost in deep regrets of her days of liberty and danger on the sea. The swarm of renegades, dock masters, berthing masters, gatemen, and such like appear to nurse an immense distrust of the captive ship's resignation. There never seem chains and ropes enough to satisfy their minds concerned with the safe binding of free ships to the strong, muddy, enslaved earth. You had better put another bite of a hawser astern, Mr. Mate, is the usual phrase in their mouth. I brand them for renegades because most of them have been sailors in their time, as if the infirmities of old age, the gray hair, the wrinkles at the corner of their eyes, and the knotted veins of their hands were the symptoms of moral poison. They prowl about the quays with an underhand air of gloating over the broken spirit of noble captives. They want more fenders, more breasting ropes. They want more springs, more shackles, more fetters. They want to make ships with volatile souls as motionless as square blocks of stone. They stand on the mud of pavements, these degraded sea dogs, with long lines of railway trucks clanking their couplings behind their backs, and run malevolent glances over your ship from headgear to taffrail, only wishing to tyrannize over the poor creature under the hypocritical cloak of benevolence and care. Here and there, cargo cranes looking like instruments of torture for ships swing cruel hooks at the end of long chains. Gangs of dock laborers swarm with muddy feet over the gangways. It is a moving sight, this, of so many men of the earthy, who never cared anything for a ship, trampling unconcerned, brutal and hobnailed upon her helpless body. Fortunately, nothing can deface the beauty of a ship, that sense of a dungeon, that sense of a horrible and degrading misfortune overtaking a creature fair to see and safe to trust, attaches only to ships moored in the docks of great European ports. You feel that they are dishonestly locked up, to be hunted about from wharf to wharf on a dark, greasy, square pool of black water as a brutal reward at the end of a faithful voyage. A ship anchored in an open roadstead with cargo lighters alongside and her own tackle swinging the burden over the rail, is accomplishing in freedom a function of her life. There is no restraint, there is space, clear water around her, and a clear sky above her, mastheads with a landscape of green hills and charming bays opening round her anchorage. She is not abandoned by her own men to the tender mercies of shore people. She still shelters and is looked after by her own little devoted band, and you feel that presently she will glide between the headlands and disappear. It is only at home in dock that she lies abandoned, shut off from freedom by all the artifices of men that think of quick dispatch and profitable freights. It is only then that the odious rectangular shadows of walls and roofs fall upon her decks with showers of soot. To a man who has never seen the extraordinary nobility, strength, and grace that the devoted generations of shipbuilders have evolved from some pure nooks of their simple souls, the sight that could be seen 25 years ago of a large fleet of clippers moored along the north side of the new South Dock was an inspiring spectacle. Then there was a quarter of a mile of them, from the iron dockyard gates guarded by policemen, and a long forest-like perspective of masts, moored two and two to many stout wooden jetties, their spars dwarfed with their loftiness, the corrugated iron sheds, their jib booms extended far over the shore, their white and gold figureheads almost dazzling in their purity, overhung the straight long quay above the mud and dirt of the wharf side, with the busy figures of groups of single men moving to and fro, restless and grimy, under their soaring immobility. At tide time you would see one of the loaded ships with battened down hatches drop out of the ranks and float in the clear space of the dock, held by lines dark and slender, like the first threads of a spider's web, extending from her bows and her quarters to the mooring post on shore. There, graceful and still, like a bird ready to spread its wings, she waited till, at the opening of the gates, a tug or two would hurry in noisily, hovering round her with an air of fuss and solicitude, and take her out into the river, tending, shepherding her through open bridges, through dam-like gates, between the flat pier heads, with a bit of green lawn surrounded by gravel and a white signal mast with yard and gaff, flying a couple of dingy blue, red, or white flags. This New South Dock, it was its official name, round which my earlier professional memories are centered, belongs to the group of West India docks, together with two smaller and much older basins called Import and Export, respectively, both with the greatness of their trade departed from them already. Picturesque and clean as docks go, these twin basins spread side by side, the dark luster of their glassy water sparsely peopled by a few ships laid up on buoys or tucked far away from each other at the end of sheds in the corners of empty quays, where they seemed to slumber quietly remote, untouched by the bustle of men's affairs. In retreat rather than activity, they were quaint and sympathetic, those two homely basins, unfurnished and silent, with no aggressive display of cranes, no apparatus of hurry and work on their narrow shores, no railway lines cumbered them. The knots of laborers trooping in clumsily round the corners of cargo sheds to eat their food in peace out of red cotton handkerchiefs had the air of picnicking by the side of a lonely mountain pool. They were restful and I should say very unprofitable, those basins where the chief officer of one of the ships involved in the harassing, strenuous, noisy activity of the New South Dock, only a few yards away could escape in the dinner hour to stroll, unhampered by men and affairs, meditating, if he chose, on the vanity of all things human. At one time they must have been full of good old slow West Indiamen of the square stern type that took their captivity, one imagines, as stolidly as they had faced the buffeting of the waves with their blunt, honest bows, and disgorged sugar, rum, molasses, coffee, or logwood sedately with their own winch and tackle. But when I knew them of exports, there was never a sign that one could detect, and all the imports I've ever seen were some rare cargoes of tropical timber, enormous bulks roughed out of iron, trunks grown in the woods about the Gulf of Mexico. They lay piled up in stacks of mighty boles, and it was hard to believe that all this mass of dead and stripped trees had come out of the flanks of a slender, innocent-looking little bark, with, as likely as not, a homely woman's name, Ellen this or Annie that, upon her fine bows. But this is generally the case with a discharged cargo. Once spread at large over the quay, it looks the most impossible bulk to have all come there out of that ship alongside. They were quiet, serene nooks in the busy world of docks, these basins where it has never been my good luck to get a berth after some more or less arduous passage, but one could see at a glance that men and ships were never hustled there. They were so quiet that, remembering them well, one comes to doubt that they ever existed. Places of repose for tired ships to dream in, places of meditation rather than work, where wicked ships, the cranky, the lazy, the wet, the bad, sea-boats, the wild steerers, the capricious, the pig-headed, the generally ungovernable, would have full leisure to take count and repent of their sins, sorrowful and naked, with their rent garments of sailcloth stripped off them, and with the dust and ashes of the London atmosphere upon their mastheads, for that the worst of ships would repent if she were given time, I make no doubt. I have known too many of them. No ship is wholly bad, and now that their bodies that had braved so many tempests have been blown off the face of the sea by a puff of steam, the evil and the good together into the limbo of things that have served their time, there can be no harm in affirming that in these vanished generations of willing servants there never has been one utterly unredeemable soul. In the New South Dock there was certainly no time for remorse, introspection, repentance, or any phenomena of inner life either for the captive ships or for their officers. From 6 in the morning till 6 at night, the hard labor of the prison house, which rewards the valiance of ships that win the harbor, went on steadily, great slings of general cargo swinging over the rail, to drop plump into the hatchways at the, at the sign of the gangway's tender's hand. The New South Dock was especially a loading dock for the colonies in those great and last days of smart wool clippers, good to look at and well exciting to handle. Some of them were more fair to see than the others. Many were, to put it mildly, somewhat overmasted. All were expected to make good passages, and of all that line of ships whose rigging made a thick, enormous network against the sky, whose Brasses flashed almost as far as the eye of the policeman at the gates could reach. There was hardly one that knew of any other port amongst all the ports on the wide earth but London and Sydney, or London and Melbourne, or London and Adelaide, perhaps with Hobart Town added for those of smaller tonnage. One could almost have believed, as her grey-whiskered second mate used to say of the old Duke of S., that they knew the road to the antipodes better than their own skippers, who year in, year out took them from London, the place of captivity, to some Australian port, where 25 years ago, though moored well and tight enough to the wooden wharves, they felt themselves no captives, but honoured guests. These towns of the antipodes, not so great then as they are now, took an interest in the shipping, the running links with home, whose numbers confirmed the sense of their growing importance. They made it part and parcel of their daily interests. This was especially the case in Sydney, where from the heart of the fair city down the vista of important streets could be seen the wool clippers lying at the circular quay. No walled prison house of a dock that, but the integral part of one of the finest, most beautiful, vast and safe bays the sun ever shone upon. Now great steamliners lie these berths, always reserved for the sea aristocracy, grand and imposing enough ships, but here today and gone next week, whereas the general cargo emigrant and passenger clippers of my time, rigged with heavy spars and built on fine lines, used to remain for months together, waiting for their load of wool. Their names attained the dignity of household words. On Sundays and holidays the citizens trooped down on visiting bent, and the lonely officer on duty solaced himself by playing the cicerone, especially to the citizenesses, with engaging manners and a well-developed sense of the fun that may be got out of the inspection of ships' cabins and staterooms. The tinkle of more or less untuned cottage pianos floated out of open stern ports till the gas lamps began to twinkle in the streets, and the ship's night watchman, coming sleepily on duty after his unsatisfactory day's slumber, hauled down the flags and fastened a lighted lantern at the break of the gangway. The night closed rapidly upon the silent ships with their crews on shore. Up a short, steep ascent by the King's Head pub, patronized by the cooks and stewards of the fleet, the voice of a man crying hot Savoys at the end of George Street, where the cheap eating-houses, 6 pence a meal, were kept by Chinamen, sun-come-ons, was not bad, is heard at regular intervals. I have listened for hours to this most pertinacious peddler. I wonder whether he is dead or has made a fortune, while sitting on the rail of the old Duke of S. She's dead, poor thing, a violent death on the coast of New Zealand. Fascinated by the monotony, the regularity, the abruptness of the recurring cry, and so exasperated at the absurd spell that I wished the fellow would choke himself to death with a mouthful of his own infamous wares. A stupid job, and fit only for an old man. My comrades used to tell me to be the night watchman of a captive, though honoured ship, and generally the oldest of the able seamen in a ship's crew does get it. But sometimes neither the oldest nor any of the fairly steady seamen is forthcoming. Ships' crews had the trick of melting away swiftly in those days, so probably on account of my youth, innocence, and pensive habits, which made me sometimes dilatory in my work about the rigging, I was suddenly nominated in our chief mate, Mr. B.'s most sardonic tones, to that enviable situation. I do not regret the experience. The night humors of the town descended from the street to the waterside in the still watches of the night, larrikins rushing down in bands to settle some quarrel by a stand-up fight, away from the police in an indistinct ring half hidden by piles of cargo, with the sounds of blows, a groan now and then, the stamping of feet, and the cry of time, rising suddenly above the sinister and excited murmurs. Night prowlers perusing with a stifled shriek, followed by a profound silence, or slinking stealthily alongside like ghosts, and addressing me from the quay below in mysterious tones with incomprehensible propositions. The cabmen, too, who twice a week, on the night when the ASN Company's passenger boat was due to arrive, used to range a battalion of blazing lamps opposite the ship, were very amusing in their way. They got down from their perches and told each other impolite stories in racy language, every word of which reached me distinctly over the bulwarks as I sat smoking on the main hatch. On one occasion I had an hour or so of a most intellectual conversation with a person whom I could not see distinctly, a gentleman from England. He said with a cultivated voice, I on deck and he on the quay, sitting on the case of a piano, landed out of our hold that very afternoon, and smoking a cigar which smelt very good. We touched in our discourse upon science, politics, natural history, and operatic singers. Then, after remarking abruptly, You seem to be rather intelligent, my man, he informed me pointedly that his name was Mr. Signor, and walked off to his hotel, I suppose. Shadows, shadows. I think I saw a white whisker as he turned under the lamp-post. It is a shock to think that in the natural course of nature he must be dead by now. There was nothing to object to in his intelligence, but a little dogmatism maybe, and his name was Signor, Mr. Signor. The position had its drawbacks, however. One wintry, blustering, dark night in July, as I stood sleepily out in the rain under the break of the poop, something resembling an ostrich dashed up the gangway. I say ostrich because the creature, though it ran on two legs, appeared to help its progress by working a pair of short wings. It was a man, however, only his coat, ripped up the back and flapping in two halves above his shoulders, gave him that weird and fowl-like appearance. At least I suppose it was his coat, for it was impossible to make him out distinctly. How he managed to come so straight upon me at speed and without a stumble over a strange deck, I cannot imagine. He must have been able to see in the dark better than any cat. He overwhelmed me with panting entreaties to let him take shelter till morning in our forecastle. Following my strict orders, I refused his request, mildly at first, in a sterner tone as he insisted, with growling impudence. For God's sake, let me, matey. Some of 'em are after me, and I've got hold of a ticker here. You clear out of this, I said. Don't be hard on a chap, old man, he whined pitifully. Now then, get ashore at once. Do you hear? Silence. He appeared to cringe, mute as if words had failed him through grief. Then bang came a concussion and a great flash of light in which he vanished, leaving me prone on my back with the most abominable black eye that anybody ever got in the faithful discharge of duty. Shadows, shadows. I hope he escaped the enemies he was fleeing from to live and flourish to this day, but his fist was uncommonly hard and his aim miraculously true in the dark. There were other experiences less painful and more funny for the most part, with one amongst them of a dramatic complexion, but the greatest experience of them all was Mr. B., our chief mate himself. He used to go ashore every night to foregather in some hotel's parlor with his crony, the mate of the bark Sicero, lying on the other side of the circular quay. Late at night I would hear from afar their stumbling footsteps and their voices raised in endless argument. The mate of the Cicero was seeing his friend on board. They would continue their senseless, muddled discourse in tones of profound friendship for half an hour or so at the shore end of our gangway, and then I would hear Mr. B. insisting that he must see the other on board his ship, and away they would go, their voices still conversing with excessive amity, being heard moving all round the harbor. It happened more than once that they would thus perambulate 3 or 4 times the distance, each seeing the other on board his ship out of pure and disinterested affection. Then, through sheer weariness, or perhaps in a moment of forgetfulness, they would manage to part from each other somehow, and by the planks of our long gangway would bend and creak under the weight of Mr. B., coming on board for good at last. On the rail his burly form would stop and stand swaying. "Watchman, sir." A pause. He waited for a moment of steadiness before negotiating the 3 steps of the inside ladder from rail to deck, and the watchman, taught by experience, would forbear offering help, which would be received as an insult at that particular stage of the mate's return. But many times I trembled for his neck. He was a heavy man. Then with a rush and a thump it would be done. He never had to pick himself up, but it took him a minute or so to pull himself together after the descent. "Watchman, sir." "Captain, aboard." "Yes, sir." Pause. "Dog aboard." "Yes, sir." Pause. Our dog was a gaunt and unpleasant beast, more like a wolf in poor health than a dog, and I never noticed Mr. B. at any other time show the slightest interest in the doings of the animal, but that question never failed. "Let's have your arm to steady me along." I was always prepared for that request. He leaned on me heavily till near enough the cabin door to catch hold of the handle. Then he would let go my arm at once. "That'll do, I can manage now." And he could manage. He could manage to find his way into his berth, light his lamp, get into his bed, and get out of it when I called him at 5:30, the first man on deck, lifting the cup of morning coffee to his lips with a steady hand, ready for duty as though he had virtuously slept 10 solid hours. A better chief officer than many a man who had never tasted grog in his life. He could manage all that, but could never manage to get on in life. Only once he failed to seize the cabin door handle at the first grab. He waited a little, tried again, and again failed. His weight was growing heavier on my arm. He sighed slowly. "Damn that handle." Without letting go his hold of me, he turned about. His face lit up bright as day by the full moon. "I wish she were out at sea," he growled savagely. "Yes, sir." I felt the need to say something, because he hung on to me as if lost, breathing heavily. "Ports are no good. Ships rot. Men go to the devil." I kept still, and after a while he repeated with a sigh, "I wish she were at sea out of this." "So do I, sir," I ventured. Holding my shoulder, he turned upon me. What's that to you where she is? You don't drink." And even on that night he managed it at last. He got hold of the handle, but he did not manage to light his lamp. I don't think he even tried, though in the morning, as usual, he was the first on deck, bull-necked, curly-headed, watching the hands turn to with his sardonic expression and unflinching gaze. I met him 10 years afterwards, casually, unexpectedly in the street, on coming out of my consignee office. I was not likely to have forgotten him with his "I can manage now." He recognized me at once, remembered my name, and in that ship I had served under his orders. He looked me over from head to foot. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I am commanding a little bark," I said, "loading her for Mauritius." Then thoughtlessly I added, "And what are you doing, Mr. B?" "I," he said, looking at me unflinchingly with his old sardonic grin, "I am looking for something to do." I felt I would rather have bitten out my tongue. His jet-black curly hair had turned iron gray. He was scrupulously neat as ever, but frightfully threadbare. His shiny boots were worn down at heel, but he forgave me, and we drove off together in a hansom to dine on board my ship. He went over her conscientiously, praised her heartily, congratulated me on my command with absolute sincerity. At dinner, as I offered him wine and beer, he shook his head, and as I sat looking at him interrogatively, muttered in an undertone, "I'd given up all that." After dinner we came again on deck. It seemed as though he could not tear himself away from the ship. We were fitting some new lower rigging, and he hung about approving, suggesting, giving me advice in his old manner. Twice he addressed me as "my boy," and corrected himself quickly to "captain." My mate was about to leave me to get married, but I concealed the fact from Mr. B. I was afraid he would ask me to give him the berth in some ghastly jocular hint that I could not refuse to take. I was afraid. It would have been impossible. I could not have given orders to Mr. B, and I am sure he would not have taken them from me very long. He could not have managed that, though he had managed to break himself from drink too late. He said good-bye at last, as I watched his burly, bull-necked figure walk away up the street. I wondered with a sinking heart whether he had much more than the price of a night's lodging in his pocket, and I understood that if, that very minute, I were to call out after him, he would not even turn his head. He too is no more than a shadow, but I seemed to hear his words spoken on the moonlit deck of the old Duke of S. "Ports are no good, ships rot, men go to the devil."